Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Finally Quit Porn podcast. Today we are going to talk about Sissy Hypno porn. I think this podcast will help a lot of people struggling with this right now. If you are not struggling with this kind of porn category in particular, then I would probably recommend just missing this episode out, moving on to the next one. So welcome back onto the podcast today, Mary. How are you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah, not bad, thanks. And I want to talk about this topic for a number of reasons, but one of them is just to be like very transparent and honest, is that this is something I did struggle with to some extent in the peak of my pornography addiction, is basically was more actually looking at photos on Instagram. They're like these sissy caption photos on Instagram, where it was basically about you dressing up as a woman and like sucking off guys, like giving guys blowjobs and shit. So that was, I mean, I was never actually wanting to do any of that stuff, but they basically had these photos of like really attractive women in the on the Instagram, and then they had like these captions. And for whatever reason, it was basically the most extreme content I could find on Instagram. And I had the junky thinking back then of, oh, it doesn't count as porn because it's not on a porn site. So this is okay. It's not too bad. So it was basically the most, yeah, extreme content I could find on social media sites like Instagram. And I think that was probably the main site I looked at that stuff on. But yeah, I basically looked on YouTube and I came across a few videos talking about sissy porn, hypno, recovery. And it turns out there's thousands and thousands of men who are actually really, really quite deep into this category of porn. And there's videos out there where people will basically be told to like dress up as women and do certain things. And it's like a really fetish sized version of being trans. And I just think this is really, really unhealthy for a lot of people. And I think a lot of people are now questioning their sexual identity, whether they're straight, bi, whatever, gay, and they're quite confused. But in my opinion, I think for a lot of people, it's actually just to do with addiction and the tolerance cycle. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask you, I suppose, what do you think?
Well, what does that even mean? Sissy hypno? I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, so essentially the sissy part is I think it's like dressing up as a woman and being like really, really feminine. And then the hypno part is kind of you're sort of hypnotized into wanting to dress up as a woman. And it's like feminization, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I kind of feel like, if it doesn't really matter who you want to have sex with or how you want to dress or any of it, it's like up to people what they want to do with who they want to do it with. But when it comes to being online, virtual sex, you know what I mean? And not being able to stop yourself from doing it and feeling compelled to do it, and then doing more and more and more and more of it. And whether you start out, straight man looking for women on there, or you start out gay man looking for men, or you start out transgender looking for whatever, man, women, I don't know, bi, whatever. If you're feeling so compelled that you got to go get this sexual stimulation on, virtually online, and you're not even engaging with real people and you can't stop doing it, that's where we come in, and I feel like too, we talked about maybe, helping people identify if they feel like they have an addiction to porn, whether it's sissy, hypno, or whatever the hell it is, making a questionnaire so they can help identify. For me, it's like, have you tried to stop? If you even have to try to stop and then you continue doing it, that's a red flag right there,
Mm.
And then, or the guys with the streaks, if you're doing streaks, definitely you have an addiction. If you feel like you're trying to control it, well, if you have a spontaneous behavior, you know, just where you want to just check out or feel different or whatever, and you don't have to think about trying to stop doing it, well then, you know, have behaviors that you check out, you know, have a drink here and there, whatever, and just have sex, whatever. It's but when you feel compelled and you can't stop, and then you end up getting into like more and more extreme stuff, you know, it's definitely an issue, you know.
Yeah, yeah, big time. And I think for a lot of straight guys in particular, they feel a lot of like shame around this category in particular because they actually are fully straight and it just doesn't align with who they are at all. And actually they're getting really turned on in particular by the fact that they are being sort of degraded, and it's almost like in your head you're thinking to yourself like, I want to feel as horrendous as possible. I want to feel absolutely worthless, disgusting, ashamed. I want to do all of that. And that's kind of part of the addiction because that actually releases certain chemicals in the brain, which can actually be related over time with sexual pleasure. And the addicted part of the mind can come up with all kinds of bullshit excuses, rationalizations to engage in that content. And I
Yeah.
think it can really impact people, especially in terms of the shame side. And yeah, this podcast, this video, it's not really for anybody who is necessarily like just happy and content with looking at that content. This is for people who are looking at that stuff because they're compelled, they're driven, they're obsessed, and they're in an addiction. They have addictive neural pathways. That's why they're looking at it. And they don't need to go and figure out and do some therapy to try and get to some root cause, because I think for a lot of people, they're looking at this stuff because it's like some of the most extreme content they can actually watch in terms of how it makes them feel about themselves and how it just how extreme it is really. And people go to extreme stuff in addiction. You know, a lot of people start off
Yeah.
with minor stuff and it does progress over time, and that's because eventually the old stuff doesn't really do it for you anymore. So then you trying to get the most extreme stuff you can find, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and you know, a couple things like maybe they think, oh, if I do this really extreme thing, then I'm going to be disgusted with myself enough that I'm going to be, you know, motivated to stop the behavior. That's like, you know, people binge drinking or, you know, smoking, you know, 5 packs of cigarettes nonstop in order to get themselves like so disgusted with themselves that they're going to be motivated to stop or
That's what I did. That's exactly what I did. Yeah. Like honestly, I would look at that stuff just because I wanted to basically feel so horrendous about myself and so
yeah,
ashamed that I'd be like, well, I am never ever doing that again. But then what would
yeah,
happen is I'd have that full on relapse, feel so bad. You know, I wouldn't want to see anyone afterwards. I was so ashamed, and this is my first time talking about it as well. To be honest with you, I've not even
yeah,
told like my friends or anyone about this, and I don't really feel like I actually need to. I don't really think they'd care or judge me that much because they probably have a
right,
decent understanding of addiction and they just love me for who I am and they know that, that's part of my past now and I've done that and I can't really, I'd love to go back in time and remove
yeah,
the fact that I had done that. But, at the same time, it's like, okay, well, I kind of forgive myself and I go, I was in an addiction back then. I had addictive neural pathways. That's all that was going on. And now that I'm out of that addiction, like I couldn't tell you how little craving or desire I've ever had really to look at that stuff again because
yeah.
it's just not me. Like it just doesn't align with who I am or my sexual tastes at all. It's
Yeah.
so far from it.
Well, it speaks to also how we talk about, you know, not judging people for whatever addiction they have. It's just like addiction is addiction is addiction. You get neural pathways, you have this desire, you want to change the way you feel, and the tolerance. I mean, you're going to build the tolerance, you want more and more. And like some of the people, you know, over the years that I've worked with that have food compulsion, I mean, talk about embarrassing things, you know. I mean, good Lord, what they would do with food that they would reveal to me, they would never say to their friends or to other people, you know. But whatever the addiction is, it's like it gets very extreme because it's not enough. It's insatiable, and it's just you want more and more and more to get that feeling of relief, you know. So it's just the way it works. And whether it's you know, like I've talked about the guy who would suck the jelly out of the donuts and then re-inject them with whipped cream. I mean, there you go. You go to some extreme porn site, kind of the same thing, you know, re-injecting your donuts, you know. I mean, it's
Yeah.
definitely just the pattern of how excuse me, of how addiction works, you know. It's doesn't really matter what the addiction is, and there's obviously no judgment about it. If we
Yeah,
were going to
big
be
time.
super judgmental about addiction, we sure as hell wouldn't be doing this work, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's coming to mind for me now that I found quite interesting actually talking through this is that the addictive part of my mind was really, really sort of latching on to this idea that it wasn't porn because it was on sites like YouTube and
Yeah,
Instagram. Because yeah, come to think of it now, I watched a few videos on YouTube as well. And that idea that it's not on a porn site was like the justification for it. And that's what happens in addiction is people make so many justifications so they can engage. So like
yeah,
your guy with the donut, maybe he was saying on some level like, oh, well, it's okay, I'm not eating that much here because I'm only eating like the middle of the donut, I'm not going to eat the whole
right,
thing. But it's like
yeah,
when you zoom out of that addiction entirely and you look at someone injecting donuts with whipped cream, it's like you are 100% addicted. Like that
yeah.
is a sure sign you're addicted if you have to go to that extreme to try and get away with the behavior that's actually causing you so much misery.
And you're hiding it. You know, it's really interesting because people say how, you know, it's so acceptable to be, you know, just with the food addiction and whatever. In my experience, food compulsives do not do what the things they do with food in public. They go out and they eat like a bird and act like they're, you know, they're on some diet and eating healthy and eating nutritiously or whatever. And then they go drive through Dairy Queen on the way home after they eat with their friends and eat their salad or whatever, you know. It's like it is the, I would say, probably the most hidden as far as like the real reality of what people do with addictions, you know. I think
Yeah.
you're going to be more likely to see um, somebody shooting heroin in front of you than you would see what people do with food behind
Oh
closed
yeah,
doors.
no, big time. My friend actually was telling me about his experience living with this friend of his who I think he worked at the pub with her or something, and they lived together for quite a while. Um, and no one I know who knows him is listening to this, so I feel like it's probably a safe space to share this. And also, I don't even know the person, but long story short, he was living with somebody, and they had a food compulsion, you know, very obvious. They could
Yeah,
tell physically. And yeah, they'd eat healthily, like every single meal. And at first,
yeah,
my friend, you know, for the first few months was a bit confused, like, how is this person that overweight when they eat healthy all
yeah,
the time? Over time, you know, months passed by, and what he discovered is that she'd actually take loads of food from the like kitchen and go and eat it in her room and like act like she was eating healthy all the time in front of him and
yeah,
like talking about being on diets and stuff. And yeah, it's just prime sort of food compulsion. And I think with the porn stuff, you know, obviously you really do want to hide those like categories. Like that's why people like clear their browsing history. You know, I think I
yeah,
had private Instagram accounts at one point that I didn't, you know, no one knew about to look at that sort of content on Instagram. And this is a bit of a side note, and I don't want to come up with some like BS excuse for looking at that stuff, but I also just think it's crazy how that stuff even is on YouTube and Instagram, and like kids, like literally 8 years old, now have access to. Well, I don't know how old you actually have to be on those sites, but like really young people now have access to what I would regard as really
yeah.
quite extreme sexual content that can get people questioning their sexual identity and all sorts.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because that's like we've compared food compulsion to porn compulsion, and have seen so many similarities. And that's another one is like how hidden it really is, you know. I think they're probably pretty close.
Mm.
Um, as far as like how secretive the behavior is and not shared with other people because a lot of the other addictions people get together, smokers get together and smoke people get together and drink, you know, drug addicts do cocaine together, whatever, you know. But I think that the YouTube, thank God, when they post those things, they can be set to adult or child if it's appropriate for a child, like maybe. But then
Yeah.
again, you know, how do you know who's logging in? You know, if you're a kid, you can log it. I'm sure there's ways for kids to be getting to that stuff. You know, that's really sad. It's
Yeah.
really sad. It's unfortunate, but you know,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
you
Well, I
know,
think we could maybe wrap it up here. It's been quite a short episode, but I just wanted to make this to kind of share my story a little bit. Maybe it will relieve some feelings of shame for anyone else who's ever been caught up in that particular category, because I know how harmful it can be for your mental health when you're going through that. And yeah, if you want more sort of support or help in terms of quitting porn, we do have some free training at www.thomasmolyneux.com. Go and check that out. Hopefully that can put you one step towards permanent freedom. Thanks as always, Mary, for joining me for today's podcast, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.
bye bye.